Mr. Davis, would the judge and everyone underneath her would go underneath the same sentence, or would they be convicted of a 30-year maximum jail time? Or what would you like to see happen basically to these people once they are brought to justice themselves?
Since they what?
Since they my question is, what would you like to see happen for justice?
What would I like to see happen for justice? I would like the DNA evidence to come to light. That's number one. Number two, I would like to see these district attorneys brought into court and made to answer for the crimes that they committed. Number three, I would like to investigate this case even further and have my plea agreement withdrawn. And here is why. When I was prosecuted, the only two things that I had, the only two pieces of evidence that I had was that the victim's hymen was still intact, and that once that they were going to bring a expert in to prove how a girl's hymen can grow back, which I have gone over that particular statement. At that point, I knew I was facing a stacked deck because I had no way of proving my innocence. I did not have the evidence that I have now, or if I did, I would have never taken a plea agreement. Here is another thing that I want to bring out. There has been, while I was incarcerated at New Lisbon Correctional Institute, we helped, me and several other people that worked in the legal library, we helped several men get their plea agreement withdrawn. And
Which means
that their conviction was redone altogether. What they didn't know was that the DNA evidence matched in their criminal conviction. These two gentlemen were facing 5 years in prison and 5 years on extended supervision. When they withdrew their plea agreement for that conviction, they went after them. Using the DNA evidence, they convicted one man and sentenced him to 60 years in prison. They convicted the second man and sentenced him to 80 years in prison. Now, here's the key point I'm trying to get at. This is a common occurrence that if a person is allowed to withdraw their plea agreement, they bring all the evidence against them now. And if I was a district attorney and I had given a man a second chance by giving him 5 years in prison and 5 years on extended supervision, and he wanted his sentence, his plea agreement withdrawn, I would take and I would barbecue that person if you had DNA evidence that did match. Now, if this is the case, which has happened many times in this court in Milwaukee County and courts all over the entire United States, if this is the case, why is it that John Chisholm and the district attorney's office and all of the district attorneys in Milwaukee County, when I have hit the Milwaukee County Circuit Court 3 times with the opportunity to withdraw my plea agreement, and they refuse to do so, which tells me that, number one, they don't want this case to come to court for one reason: they know they'd be proven wrong. Number two, the DNA evidence that they said did not exist would come to light and it would prove me innocent. And number three, they knew that the second that I brought this case to court and I got my plea agreement withdrawn and it got into court, that once that happened, the state of Wisconsin would be responsible for a huge amount of money in a lawsuit that when I filed a motion to withdraw my plea in U.S. District Court under the Eastern District of Wisconsin, there was two parts of that lawsuit. One of them was my conviction. That was for the amount of money that I was asking for in that particular court case was $30 million. When Barbara Crabb issued her statement, she said, and I quote, that once I got the DNA evidence, then she would rule on my conviction. And I've been fighting it ever since to get that critical DNA evidence. As it is, and it stands right now, if all of the evidence comes to light in court, it's enough to prove me innocent as it stands, because Laura Arbuckle has said that the evidence that they had did not prove me guilty, which means I was not responsible for this crime, and I had no connection to this crime to begin with, and they knew it, and they continued with prosecution. That is one thing that they don't want to ever appear into any court in any way, in any shape, in any form, because of those three reasons. One, they don't want to be proven wrong. Number two, the DNA evidence would prove me innocent. And number three, the state of Wisconsin would be responsible for a huge lawsuit, and they know it. They knew all of the DNA evidence and all of the evidence that they were concealing. When they had all the evidence, they knew that I had no connection to this crime. And I'm going to bring up one more point. In a Seventh Circuit Court case, Newsom versus McCabe, at trial of 42 U.S.C. 1983, which is a fancy way of describing a federal lawsuit. The jury found that by concealing evidence that was favorable to the defendant, that when they concealed that evidence, they violated Newsom's due process rights. The jury awarded him $1 million a year for every year he'd been under custody. I have been under custody for over 20 years. So that kind of tells you just exactly how much money is on the line. And the state, and they don't want the state to have to pay out a bunch of money because they were wrong and they knew it, and they continued with prosecution, which is abuse of discretion, violation of due process, and several other things that I have brought up at the very beginning of this start of these things that I've been bringing out to you at this point. The point I'm trying to make is this: they knew I was innocent. They knew the evidence. They had full knowledge of the evidence, and they continued with prosecution. Why? Because they were too far and too deep into this case to stop at that point, and if they did, they would have been fired, and their license would have been pulled. Their license to practice law would have been pulled, and they would have been able to be sued in not only professionally but also personally, and they would have lost everything they owned. And I would have done it, and I would have taken everything that they owned and 1/3 of their paycheck for the rest of their lives. This is why they don't want to do this. This is why they don't want to withdraw my plea agreement.
Now, Mr. Davis, just a quick question. What has this cost you mentally besides aggravation and missing out on family events? What exactly kept you going through all of this is a question that I want to ask.
The one thing that kept me going is the fact that I knew I was innocent. I just couldn't prove it at the time. The things I missed out on was going and seeing my family, seeing my daughter, my grandsons, my my oldest boy, my middle boy, and the youngest boy that I have. All of them have been affected by this. All of them lost their father when he was wrongfully convicted to start with. What has happened to me? My entire life has been turned upside down when I never did anything wrong. And this came out of the blue. I had no idea that this was coming. But prior to that happening, I was running a carpet cleaning business, and my live-in girlfriend at the time that I was living with, Melanie Weibel, was wanting to get control of the finances of that carpet cleaning business. Well, when I told her no, 2 days later, this thing popped open. So that kind of tells you exactly what was going on when this thing hit.